How would you say, I'm not used to that work?
Na klappetje lesje noboshen.
Welcome back to nÉces, Not Difficult in Old Irish. This is the research podcast of the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. My name is Nina Knogelkiu, and I'm an O'Donovan postdoctoral scholar here in the school. Today, I'm talking to Dr Viktoriia Krivoshchekova, another O'Donovan scholar in the school, and a behind-the-scenes member of the nÉces production team. From her discovery of Irish dancing at age 6 years old, all the way to investigating homicide in medieval Irish law, she will tell us all about her research on intellectual history, philosophy, linguistics, emotions and thoughts through Irish and Latin sources. Enjoy! So, welcome to the public-facing part of the podcast, Viktoriia. So maybe we'll begin by talking a bit about your background. You're quite the international researcher. You've lived in Russia, in Germany, in Hungary, and for the last few years in Ireland. So maybe let's start by talking about how you got interested in medieval Ireland in the first place and what led you to move to Ireland to study.
Well, yes, that's a kind of a long story. So imagine this. I am a small little child of maybe 6 years old, and I'm in a dance theater. And we have this rehearsal space for our dance troupe. And one day we get this kind of like a river dance knockoff theater company coming to rehearse in our hall, like in our space. And I was just sitting there in the corner, so in awe of these beautiful dancers doing all of these beautiful things with their legs. And I was so impressed. And ever since then, there was this mystical image of Ireland in my mind that I kind of kept hidden in my soul for a long time. And then when I was doing my undergrad, I was really enjoying the course on medieval history, and I wanted to do my thesis on medieval history. So I approached a potential supervisor, and I said that maybe I wanted to do something vaguely related to Ireland. And she was immediately like, well, here is the life of St. Columbanus and the letters of St. Columbanus. Please translate them, and this will be your project. Wow. And so that's how I started in Celtic studies, I suppose, and then I just stuck with that topic through my master's and my PhD.
Wow, that's a long story made short, but how I know there's a backstory to how you actually got to Ireland with to start your master's, and then you got on to do your PhD in Maynooth. Can we get some of that as well?
Oh, for sure. Well, I did my undergrad in Russia, and the same supervisor who introduced me to the wonderful world of Celtic studies, she insisted that I should try to get some funding to do a master's degree abroad. So I applied to go to the Central European University in Budapest. Even though there were no Celticists there, really, I still wanted to stick with my Irish topic. So I did that, working mostly on my own, even though I was still getting a lot of support from the department in other ways. And then after that, I decided to do a PhD, and I was applying to different places, for some reason not actually in Ireland, until someone somewhere in the UK told me that I should maybe try contacting Michael Clark at the University of Galway, which I did. And he was so helpful in coming together, helping me to come up with my research proposal and to refine my project. And then he suggested that I should maybe try contacting Elizabeth Boyle at Maynooth University, because she also is interested in similar topics that I am, which I did. And then eventually Elizabeth Boyle became my PhD supervisor, and that's how I ended up in Maynooth.
Wow, that's beautiful. From 6-year-old Victoria in awe with Irish dancing to all the way to intellectual medieval Irish history in Maynooth. So you came to Maynooth and you finished your PhD in 2023. So your thesis is entitled "Studies in the Linguistic Foundations of Thought in Early Irish Tradition." So that's a big title. Can you tell us a bit more about what the thesis is about?
Well, yes, this the thesis itself went through a few transformations along the way. And initially, I was interested in the way that Irish scholars in the Middle Ages understood the mind and the work of the mind. And that's what I wanted to do initially. But then as I was looking at the sources, I found that so much of Irish scholarship was concerned with language and how language works. And I thought that that was very relevant to my own interest in philosophy of mind, because, our only way to express what we think is through language, or maybe the main way to express what we think is through language. So it is very important to understand how it works and how it relates to the work of the mind. And so that's how my thesis took on the form that it has now. So I wanted to study how some problems of linguistic expression can tell us more about how the work of the mind was understood. And so to achieve this, I kind of structured the thesis in a way where I started with looking at the way that Irish grammarians understood kind of more formal aspects of language, for example, like the sound, the letter. And then I proceeded to looking at how they understood the concept of meaning and signification. And from there, I went to biblical exegesis, which is a level above even with the non-literal interpretation, which is kind of like signification once removed from the physical reference. And then I considered some ideas found in some particularly Middle Irish sources, where they kind of imagine thought as a kind of like language of the mind. So that was kind of the progression of the thesis.
Well, that sounds fascinating and a huge amount of work. So in your thesis, you said in the introduction that you kind of started with modern theories from linguistics and the philosophy of language to study those medieval sources, as you explained. So can you tell us why they were relevant and how you applied them to those medieval sources?
Well, I think generally I kind of positioned the thesis itself as a study in philosophy of language. And I think even though maybe Irish scholars themselves did not conceptualize such a discipline in their curriculum, so they did think about grammar, they think about exegesis, but not about philosophy of mind per se. But I think it definitely existed, because the way that they engage with language and the way that they really try to understand how it works, it's very philosophical in nature. So I think in that way we can speak not only of modern philosophy of language, but also medieval philosophy of language. And as you mentioned, I also used some of the kind of modern linguistic theories in some of the chapters to kind of enhance my argument. They are theories like, for example, Ferdinand de Saussure's theory of the linguistic sign. It's so ubiquitous. I think it's applicable to so many different sources from so many different periods of time, where it's kind of understanding a linguistic sign as a combination of what is signified and what signifies it. So the kind of the physical reference and the meaning. And I think that's such a fundamental theory in linguistics that I think there is no problem in applying it to historical sources as well. Even they themselves did not maybe think in the same terms as we do about it. I used some other theories as well. For example, theory by Gottlob Frege, who talks about different kinds of meaning. So he talks about reference, which is what object in the physical world a word refers to, and meaning in the sense of kind of a more abstract sense, as in meaning as a kind of ideal form of an object, not related to its physical reference. And I think that's a very important distinction, and the distinction that we find in Irish grammatical discourse, where they do think about the meaning of words as kind of physical objects consisting of letters and sounds, and also meaning as being removed from the object of reference, particularly, as I mentioned, in biblical exegesis, where non-literal interpretation is very important. So I think these theories, even though they are technically kind of anachronistic to the period, I think they have so much explanatory power that it's very helpful to use them.
Yeah, no, it's very convincing, and it sounds extremely interesting. I guess my next question is what kind of text do you use to understand all of this? How do you know what they mean, and do they discuss these things explicitly, or are there other texts that you use to understand the medieval Irish's theories and their understanding, but also how they dealt with texts and with words in practice?
I used a very wide range of sources, but as I mentioned, I focused specifically on the disciplines of grammar and biblical exegesis. So, for example, for grammar, we have this very famous vernacular grammar of the Irish language, Auraicept na nÉces, which is the first vernacular grammar in Europe. I used, this was one of my main sources. I also used many of the Hiberno Latin grammatical texts. Those texts mostly comment on authoritative grammatical manuals from the late antique period. So they themselves are trying to kind of grasp the theory that was laid out by someone else before them, and they try to make sense of it, especially because obviously these are Latin grammatical manuals, and the people who are commenting on them are Irish speakers, for whom Latin is a second language. They would engage with it differently than, for example, people in Rome would have engaged with it as native speakers of Latin. So in that sense, I think it's very interesting how medieval intellectuals, not just in Ireland, but for example in Anglo-Saxon England as well, who are non-native speakers of Latin, start learning it, and they have a different perspective on the language because it's foreign to them. And then the same kind of theoretical structure is being applied back to the vernacular in order to understand it better. So they transfer some of the grammatical concepts and terminology back to Irish and then apply it to the Irish language. So that's a whole kind of fascinating process. And for biblical exegesis, I used some of my main sources were the Würzburg and the Milan glosses. And also glosses is a whole other kind of worms, a very interesting type of source to work with. These are not kind of continuous texts, but very short, usually comments on a specific point in the main text that they comment on. And so these Old Irish glosses, they engage with the letters of St. Paul specifically in this case, and with the Psalms. And they also, due to the nature of what the main text is talking about, they then try to make sense of it in their own way. And this leads them to some very interesting reflections on the nature of language, on the nature of thought as well. And that was what I was mostly looking for in my sources. So hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And so you said that they were obviously engaging with Latin as a second language, and that shows. Well, you mentioned England as well, and so my question is, did the medieval Irish think differently than other people in continental Europe, or other people who had different, obviously, vernaculars?
That's a very interesting question, and I think it kind of brings to mind this kind of famous theory in linguistics. I think it's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, according to which the structure of your own native language determines the way you understand the world, which was kind of lost a bit of its authority or significance in the recent decades. And I think, while on the one hand, it is interesting to try to understand how someone's native language affects the way they perceive reality, for example, as in Irish, the words for green and for blue, as in color, are the same word. So what does it mean for their perception of color? But I think overall, we often talk about medieval Ireland kind of in isolation from the rest of Europe, because it is so unique in how rich its vernacular tradition is compared to the other traditions. And we tend to kind of just focus on our own sources and analyze them. But I think it's not even that Irish scholars had a different way of thinking than the rest of Europe. I just think that they had a lot in common in their intellectual method with other scholars during the same time, and a lot of Irish scholars went to the continent and engaged with scholars at various royal courts there and exchanged ideas with them. So I think it's kind of maybe a continuity of learning, but because we have so many sources surviving from Irish authors, we're able to maybe understand better how they specifically worked with their texts, how they interpreted them. So I think my point is that while on the one hand, we should definitely study Irish intellectual tradition because it's so interesting and deep, but at the same time, I think we should also not forget that it is that it exists in relation to everything else in Europe at the same time.
Yeah, and that actually brings me perfectly to my next question. As you mentioned, Irish scholars worked on the continent, and indeed the Old Irish glosses that we have are, well, at least now, survive in manuscripts which are preserved in libraries on the continent. And so, can you tell us a bit more about the bilingual sources and the Hiberno-Latin sources? What's Irish about them? How do we know that they were written by Irish people or in Ireland, but in Latin, considering that Latin was so widespread in Europe?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I guess the best starting point for that is this very famous article by Bernard Bischoff called The Turning Points in the History of Latin Exegesis, if I remember correctly, where he basically identified some of the key motifs or features that would help us to identify an anonymous Latin work as being produced by Irish scholars writing in Latin. And among those features, he identified, for example, the use of the question and answer form, as, for example, in the name of our podcast. For example, when you ask someone a question and they say, oh, it's not difficult, and then proceed to give you an explanation. That's considered an Irish feature that is often found even in their Latin writings. Some of the other ones include an extensive use of etymology, in which they were very influenced by Isidore of Seville. Other things may include, for example, enumerative lists. So Irish scholars were very fond of listing as many things of the same category as they could. So, for example, the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, the 3 persons of the Trinity, and many, many others. Another feature is the use of the 3 sacred languages, so Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And for example, when they would try to explain a word, they would give the same word in the 3 sacred languages, even if sometimes the words that they would give are completely made up, because obviously they didn't have too many opportunities to study Hebrew at that time. So these are kind of some of the key features that allow us to identify anonymous texts as Hiberno-Latin, even though in the decades after this article was published, there was some criticism raised at Bishop's points. But I think at the moment the consensus is that his argument still stands, even though we should probably be more careful when we apply those criteria to anonymous texts, and we should really make sure that we collect as many of them as possible to obtain a more well-argued result, and not just say, oh, it has only one of these features, therefore it's Irish. So I think, yeah, we should just be a bit more careful. But other than that, I definitely think that a lot of the texts that are identified as Hiberno-Latin clearly have this kind of imprint of the intellectual method that is often associated with the Irish tradition. And was there any other part to this question?
Maybe just about the bilingual sources, and you mentioned glosses, but are there also texts that are bilingual Irish and Latin without any glossing?
Yes, for sure. What comes to mind at the moment is this huge collection of homilies, a Middle Irish collection of homilies preserved in the Laura Brack, the Speckled Book. And all of those homilies are completely bilingual, which is very interesting. The kind of the proportion of Latin and Irish in them is different from homily to homily. Some of them are predominantly Irish or predominantly Latin. Some of them are very, very balanced. So, for example, my favorite homily personally is the homily on Pentecost, which is so interesting in the way that it's constructed. So it has a sentence in Latin, for example, immediately followed by an Irish translation. Sometimes the translation is very close. Sometimes it actually expands on the Latin text a little bit. And that's kind of a very rigorous approach to kind of maintaining this balance of the languages, which I think is so interesting at the time, especially when in most of Europe, Latin was so predominant, at least in kind of learned discourse, even if regular people maybe were speaking vulgar Latin or their vernaculars, but in official documents or in learned documents, it is usually Latin that we find. But the Irish tradition is really, I think, special in the way that they really make an effort to maintain the importance of the vernacular. And even this grammatical text, Auraicept na nÉces, that I mentioned before, it so proudly pronounces that Irish is the best of all languages in the world, even best than Hebrew and Greek and Latin, because it has the bits of all the other languages put together. So they're clearly very proud of their language, and they use it in many different ways.
Yeah, that's a great story. I love that story that Irish is made from the best bits of all the other languages. So that's that was a tour of your doctoral research, and so after your PhD, you started here as an O'Donovan postdoctoral scholar in nÉces. So can you tell us a bit about what you're working on at the moment, which is I guess somewhat related to what you'd started in Maynooth, related to the mind in medieval Ireland?
Yes. So when I came to nÉces, I really wanted to go back to my roots, as it were, and continue working on this project about the mind in medieval Ireland. And my goal was to kind of study different ways in which Irish texts talk about the mind. For example, sometimes they would talk about it directly, maybe in talking about the kind of anatomical aspects. For example, where is the mind located? Is it in the brain? Is it in the heart? What are the parts of the brain? And things like that. Sometimes they talk about it in a more poetic way, comparing it, for example, to some kind of a wanderer or a fugitive, how one's thoughts constantly stray. They cannot stay constant. They're always running away. You have to go and catch them all the time. That was a big concern, I think, especially for monastic audiences who really needed to be focused on prayer and reciting the Psalms, for example, but they couldn't because they kept constantly getting distracted in their mind. So that's a very interesting kind of aspect of it. And another avenue of this research that I wanted to pursue is to look at how the mind is represented in situations where it's not necessarily the topic of discussion. For example, in just kind of everyday phrases, like in English, we say something like, "Oh, I have this on my mind," or "I have something in mind that I wanted to do." Just kind of everyday phrases like that. And to study this type of language, I'm using the methods of cognitive linguistics, which is very interesting, specifically the theory of conceptual metaphor. And that is a very popular theory these days, and it's often applied to medieval sources as well, which is why I was inspired to apply it to Irish sources. And so according to this theory, kind of the way that we make sense of difficult concepts that we don't really understand very well, we compare them to our bodily experience, even often subconsciously. So, for example, to take these phrases that I used, "Oh, I have something on my mind." So basically what we are saying that the mind is a kind of surface, and then we have things on it that are our thoughts. Or when we have something in mind, the mind is a kind of a box, and we put things there and we take things out. So these are the kinds of like conceptual metaphors that exist in English, and I wanted to look at them, look at how they work in Irish as well. And I identified a few interesting linguistic patterns that they use, some of which are similar to English, because I think the use of preposition for these kinds of constructions is common in every language. But some of them are somewhat different from English. But I won't go into too much detail about it here. So basically that was kind of my original goal. But as you know, I got distracted yet again from doing that project.
Yes, I know, and that was exactly what I was going to ask next. So you've now expanded your expertise to Old Irish law. So can you tell us more about that?
Definitely. Even though it may seem completely unrelated to all of my previous research, it is actually very much related to it. And it started basically in some conversations that I had with Chelsea Collins, who works on Irish law, specifically on marriage law. But I was just telling her about my research, and she suggested that it would be very interesting to look at how the mind is understood in legal sources. For example, in situations situations where they need to determine whether some kind of an offense was committed intentionally or not. And I was very intrigued by that idea. And then I was further encouraged to pursue it by my mentor here at the Institute, Professor Liam Brenach, who recommended me some literature to start with. And that's how I kind of got embroiled in this whole law situation. But it is essentially an extension of my other research interests. And I'm trying to look at how early Irish law treated mental agency of people who are accused of various offenses. And so that's how I kind of got my start in this area.
Yeah, and so can you tell us maybe a bit more about what is early Irish law for people who might not know? Is it in Latin? Is it in Irish? And what are the texts that you look at? Are there law books or?
Oh, for sure. Well, early Irish law is a huge corpus of vernacular legal texts. Yeah, well, usually we talk about early Irish law as the vernacular portion. We also have a big collection of canon law in Latin, which originates in Ireland, but that's kind of its own thing. But yeah, early Irish law is Irish vernacular law from the earliest period, from the Old Irish period up to the early modern period. And basically, as far as I understand it at the moment, with my more or less limited knowledge of this topic, is that some of the core initial texts were written down in the Old Irish period, and then they continued to be glossed and commented on throughout the ages, accumulating more and more supplementary material. And it just continued to expand for centuries, and that's how we ended up with a massive legal corpus. And for my own research, I mostly focus on one specific text. It's called Bretha Egged, so meaning judgments of inadvertence or judgments concerning irresponsible acts. It deals primarily with offenses that are committed through negligence, but it also talks about intentional offenses and, let's call them accidental offenses. Maybe I will talk about it later. And yeah, it's very interesting, specifically for what I'm trying to look at, so the kind of mental agency in a legal context.
Yeah, all right. And so before we move on to talk a bit more about this, can you explain a bit about the judicial system in medieval Ireland? And, well, I guess especially in the early period would be what you're looking at, but how was this different from other countries, and what can you tell from the sources?
This will be me basically summarizing Fergus Kelly's guide to early Irish law. So the court procedure was quite elaborate in medieval Ireland. So usually when you have a dispute, regardless of whether it's a contract dispute or maybe a more serious offense, you would usually go and find a lawyer. Each party, what are they called in English? The plaintiff and the defendant. Yeah. Each party would lawyer up and go to court, and then the lawyers it is then the task of the lawyer to identify which path of judgment, as it is called, this specific case should be prosecuted on. So, for example, there are separate procedures for contract disputes in general. Then there is a different procedure for fixing unfair contracts. There are special provisions for cases concerned with servile groups of the population. And then there is another procedure for particularly difficult cases that cannot be resolved maybe in any other way. Then they are resolved through an ordeal. But usually when the path of judgment is chosen, then the advocates for each party present their arguments in in pleading and counter-pleading, and then a decision is usually reached and presumably enforced. And that's kind of the basic outline of the procedure. I guess we can describe this type of court procedure as adversarial, as in the two parties are arguing with each other, and this is similar, for example, to how the legal system functioned in ancient Rome, and even I think in modern legal systems based on common law, for example, the American system. And this can be contrasted with the inquisitorial system, where, for example, the court has the authority to investigate a case. And this was more common, I think, in the high medieval period on the continent. But as for the contemporary legal systems, I think from what I understand about Germanic law, I think they didn't really have this specialized profession of a lawyer or an advocate. So the procedure would have presumably been much more simplified, even though I cannot really tell you too many details about it, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. And have there been any studies comparing the vernacular law systems in medieval Europe?
Well, I think there are a couple of ongoing projects focusing on the comparative perspectives. But I think the difficulty with that is, as far as I understand, is that scholars working on continental law, they are maybe too intimidated to look at Irish law because it's so complex and so many texts don't even have translations. And another reason might be because there is this perceived notion that because Irish law was not influenced by the Roman tradition, that it is not really related to the continental systems. And I think that's, even though it might be true, for sure, Roman legal texts didn't really come to Ireland for a long time. But I think the value in comparative approaches lies in trying to determine the way that these legal texts were written. So what methods did the jurists use, for example? How did they argue that this should be, for example, conducted one way or another? And also, I think that a lot of the concepts, even though they may not be coming from the same source, they're still the same. For example, the concepts of intent and negligence existed both in Irish law and in Roman law and in the Germanic law. And so I think there's definitely value in comparing them, but we just have to be careful not to see maybe connections where we want to see them, but they're not maybe there. So it's kind of an area that you have to kind of treat with caution.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes complete sense, but it'd be really interesting to see the differences and the similarities, as you said. So yeah, now that we know a bit more about the law system in medieval Ireland, let's turn to your favorite legal topic, homicide. So now we're on an episode of Law and Order. So can you, tell us more about this. How did Irish law treat homicide cases, and then maybe we'll talk about the role of thoughts and intentions, which is your... on the one hand, there is no one tract that only deals with homicide. It's usually sprinkled in different texts because it's such a, major offense that a lot of different texts have to talk about it.
But definitely from based on my own interests, I'm looking at how these legal texts prosecute homicide based on the mental state of the person who committed it. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, Frege, for example, distinguishes between intent and negligence and some other very interesting categories of liability, which don't exactly correspond to the continental categories, which I think is interesting. So, for example, they talk about they don't really. Frege, at least, doesn't really ever talk about complete accidents, which is what I find interesting. Instead, it talks about, for example, folly, where you act irresponsibly with no goal at all. And my favorite example of this is when you're just bored, and so you startle a pig, and the pig is so kind of scared that it injures another person, and so then you're liable. And then other categories that they distinguish between are acts of social utility committed responsibly or irresponsibly. So, for example, if you are cutting trees or smithing, these are acts that are useful for the community, but you can be performing them in a way that is responsible. You could warn everyone that it's dangerous to be in this area at this time, so please stay away. Or you could just be doing them at your own will, and then people get injured. And so Frege is very attuned, I suppose, to these very minute differences in levels of liability, which is what I find the most fascinating. And then some other interesting things concerning homicide are, for example, the concept of secret murder, which is very, very serious. It incurs double the penalties of a regular murder, which I think the reason for that is that if you hide the body, that's the meaning of secret murder. You basically hide the body. If you do it, it definitely means that you intentionally did it. And so that's kind of an implicit proof of intent. Then another thing that Irish law talks about is the distinction between successful attacks and attempted murder, where you wanted to do one thing, you wanted to kill someone, but you injured them instead. So that's also, in my opinion, a very kind of advanced approach to the matter. And so, yeah, these are kind of some of the general areas that I'm interested in at the moment.
That sounds fascinating. And so what role do emotions play in this? Do they mention, do they name emotions? Do they talk about, say, like anger or fear or, I don't know, revenge, things like that?
That's a great question. Specifically, yes, they do talk about anger. And that's thank you for mentioning that, actually. That's another area that interests me. So similarly to the secret murder committed in anger also doubles the penalties. The category of anger in itself as a type of liability, to my knowledge, is unique to Irish law. But I think that for sure it is influenced by the Irish penitentials, which is another type of text that these are also texts of a regulatory nature, but they are coming from an ecclesiastical environment, and they just tell you what to do to atone for different types of sins. And so the penitentials, they do recognize anger as a category of liability, and they place it in between intent and accident. So it kind of not as bad as intentional murder, but worse than accident. So I think definitely there is this influence coming from the ecclesiastical tradition into the vernacular law. And yeah, so that's also another area that I hope to dedicate more attention to in the future.
Well, that sounds fascinating, and so much more to be done, clearly. So as we've seen, your research is incredibly wide-ranging. You touched on history, on philosophy, linguistics, the study of thoughts and emotion, medieval Irish law. What else? Loads of different things. And you also work on sources in Irish, Old Middle Irish, and Latin. So that's a lot of knowledge there in one head. So can you tell us what does this look like day to day for you? What do you do in the morning? What do you do in the afternoon?
Well, in the morning I sleep. I usually am very lazy in the morning, but no, as you may know, as my office mate, my desk is always just covered in piles and piles of different books that I'm always trying to look at the same time and fail. But basically, I think of it as kind of like conducting a little investigation, which is appropriate, I guess, where you try to connect the dots between different sources. And I think that's the kind of the main challenge of working on topics that involve a lot of different sources of a lot of different types, is to just kind of keep track of everything and be able to build these connections between different ideas that occur in different texts, but also at the same time be mindful of whether they could be directly related to each other, or if the similarity is accidental, or if maybe there is an intermediary source that connects them. So that's kind of always my main challenge in this work. But I think even when you work with one singular text, like yourself, and I think you might tell us more about it at some later stage, but usually a text is not just a thing in itself. There are so many layers of intertextuality, and you always have to think about the sources of where certain ideas might be coming from. So I think, yeah, for me, the main challenge of this kind of work is to be able to understand the connection between different sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to add to this that, because I know as your office mate that you spend a lot of time translating these sources, because much of what you work on has never been translated and sometimes not even printed in its vernacular form or in the Latin. So I must say that I'm very impressed with how much you translate of Latin and Irish and Latin and Irish and then find great connections.
Thank you.
So you've also obviously published a lot of your research in various journals, including the DIAS journal, the School of Celtic Studies journal Celtica, and also in Language and History, the journal of the Henry Sweet Society for the History of Linguistic Ideas. So I guess people will be able to go check your articles out, but do you have any other publications in the works, and can you tell us about them?
Oh, for sure. I have so many publications in various stages of progress. To be precise, I have 7. Thankfully, one of them is coming out really, really soon. It's supposed to be launched in June, and it is actually about my use of cognitive approaches to Irish texts, and I'm very excited about this. Maybe I'll mention a couple of others. I have a chapter in a volume of conference proceedings on Irish approaches to signification, which is this research is based on my thesis, and it kind of talks about how basically there was a whole spectrum of understanding what linguistic signification is. It's not like Irish tradition only has this view of this topic. It's very, very wide-ranging. For example, some sources might think of meaning as being basically implicit in the object that the word references, or other sources might think of it as being several degrees removed from reality, as, for example, as I was mentioning, in exegetical contexts. Another one, the last one that I'll mention, is my edition and translation of a very short homily on Pentecost from the Book of Armagh. It's only one page in the manuscript, but I think it's a very interesting text, both from the point of view of its location in the manuscript, as I talk about in the article, but also it's another bilingual source, mostly written in Latin, but with some Old Irish insertions. And as I argue in the article, I think the use of bilingualism there is very interesting, because the Old Irish bits, they don't translate the Latin parts, but they actually act as turning points in the text to switch the topic to a different subject. So that's a different use of bilingualism, and I talk about it in that article. And also, the article will provide the first full edition of the text and the first translation.
Oh, that's a lot to be looking forward to. I'm excited to read this. It sounds fascinating. All right, so I guess we're kind of reaching the end of this interview, but before we kind of wrap up, do you have any plans for the future? Any ways you want to take with your research? I mean, you're looking at so many different things. Is there anything in particular you'd like to do next?
Well, I think for sure I have many different ideas, but for the immediate future, I will probably stick with my law research because it's such a vast topic, and I really need more time to go a bit deeper into it. So I will. I'm currently at the moment preparing an article for publication, which will talk about some of the things that I brought up today, the categories of liability, and in the future, as I mentioned, I want to do more research on the on anger as a category of liability in itself, and potentially on other aspects of legal procedure, especially in relation to kind of like homicide cases, or maybe criminal cases, as we may call them. For example, the role of witnesses, and also the role of onlookers, because they're not the same. An onlooker is someone who is complicit in an offense because they are there and they see it and they do nothing. So that's another thing that I would like to dive more into. And also at the moment, I'm kind of putting together a larger project, a larger comparative project, actually, to look at medieval Irish glossing of Irish legal tracts in comparison to the glossing of the Roman legal corpus that started in Italy in the 12th century.
All right. A lot more to come, so. All right, so I guess my final question is for the benefit of the listeners. Do you have any recommendations of further reading for people if they want to find out more about intellectual history or medieval Irish law or any of the things we've talked about today?
Well, yeah, I think I want to mention at first maybe 3 books that really influenced my approach to historical research. And they're not necessarily about Ireland, they're more general, but I think they're really interesting. So the first one is the book called The Craft of Thought by Mary Carruthers, which kind of talks about the practice of monastic meditation in the Middle Ages and how it kind of shaped, in many ways, our medieval people's understanding of cognition and the processes involved in it. Then another book that was very important for my thesis, The Making of Textual Culture by Martin Irvine, and it talks about grammar as a key discipline in the medieval curriculum and how it basically created so many concepts in philosophy of language and also influenced medieval exegesis in many ways. So that was a really foundational book for me. And maybe another one that I will mention is about the application of cognitive approaches to medieval sources. And it's the book called Anglo-Saxon Psychologies by Leslie Lockett. And it basically applies these various cognitive theories to Anglo-Saxon material with, I would say, great success. And it really inspired me to use those theories in my own research as well. And maybe to kind of finish, I will just name two most fundamental books on early Irish law. I guess for people who are interested and who don't already know about them, it's the Guide to Early Irish Law by Fergus Kelly, which gives a great introduction and overview of basically the entirety of Irish law and its different branches and areas, and then the companion to the Corpus Juris Hibernici by Liam Brunach, which would give you a good overview of specific texts that comprise the Irish legal corpus.
Well, that's a lot of reading then for me and for our listeners. So I guess thank you, Viktoriia, for coming to the front-facing part of the podcast, and
thank you for having me, and maybe I will see you next week.
Maybe, I don't know. Thank you for listening to nÉces, the research podcast of the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. If you're interested in learning more about today's topic, check out the description below. And for more information about the school, you can go to dias.ie. More episodes are coming your way soon. Slán!